Hi, Furman. All right. Today, I was going to pick up with New Mexico. Hope you all had a good weekend. I'll try to get right into it since it's 1 o'clock. Going to look at some maps here to begin with. Can you all see this shared screen? Yes? Okay. All right. We've talked a little bit about the Spanish in Florida, and now I want to look at Spain in the west, or at least west of the Mississippi. And we have, see, an exam coming up. It'll be released to you on Friday. I'll have some practice quizzes for you here directly associated with that material that's going to be on the first midterm exam. But the first midterm exam will only go up to the material that I present to you through Thursday of this week. So nothing more than that. And you don't have a lot of reading yet, but you do have quite a bit of presentations here. So the practice quizzes should kind of guide you into what is significant. The exam will have mainly short essays, short answer questions. It'll all be written. It will not be timed, but you will have from Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday to complete it. So you have 4 days, and so it's it's kind of go at your own pace, but don't put it off, and be sure to get all the material read by the time that you begin it. So, but you'll be able to close it and come back to it. It's not a timed thing. It's more like a writing assignment. Okay. Well, last time we were talking about Spanish colonization in New Mexico. We'll come back to that map in a second. So, Spanish initially, of course, by the way, do you all have any questions about the format of the class so far? Any issues? I owe you some graded material, and I'll get you another writing assignment here directly. But if you have any questions about that, just give me an email or catch me after this lecture. It shouldn't take too long today, actually. All right, so the Spanish, recall that the Spanish in Florida were there largely for geopolitical reasons, to protect shipping lanes, to provide a buffer zone against the English, especially later on in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they didn't find large civilizations, of course, to plunder as they did in Mexico and Peru. So the Spanish continued their exploration and their colonization into the western part of North America. The western part of North America is drier and has very different topography than the eastern half of North America. So the Spanish were actually perhaps a little more acclimated to the west and exploration in the west than they were in the heavily timbered east. So anyway, the area of most successful Spanish colonization in North America is by far New Mexico. And New Mexico was originally explored because of the same reasons. The Spanish were seeking out access to civilizations to plunder initially, and one of those places was a rumor. And as we've talked about, a lot of times expeditions are following ideas, or at least they're following incorrect information. That's why Columbus never would have sailed west to get to the Far East had he been using correct information, right? At least any sane person wouldn't have done that at the time. Other attractions were based on rumor or maybe even kind of wild stories, um, like the existence of an island in the Atlantic, which got people wondering, well, maybe this is true. The Fountain of Youth in Florida is another example. The idea that there was some magical place where people were perpetually young because of some water source was enough to attract people into Florida. And you might be thinking, well, why were they so stupid? But at the time, you have to remember, Cortez stumbled on the Aztec Empire, where they had so much incredible wealth in the form of gold and silver and other other valuable possessions, as well as Peru, same thing. So that was one of those fantastic discoveries that the Spanish were, they were following all kinds of hints for other things. And one of those rumors didn't turn out to be so valuable, was something called the Seven Cities of Cibola. And this was a rumor that was referring to like a golden city somewhere in the interior of North America, somewhere in the plains, somewhere far to the north. And perhaps it was the local native peoples telling the Spanish that you don't really want to be here, you want to be about 400 or 500 miles to the north. So the Spanish kept following this rumor. They didn't really understand what was up in the north, and the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains were unknown to them. So some of the early expeditions were seeking out this mythical seven cities. Let's look at a map of the exploration route. And one of the reasons I like to talk about this is because it's sort of Oklahoma's claim to, the Spanish exploration era. And this was the idea of the seven cities was this area up here in central Kansas, which was actually the winter quarters of the Wichita Indians, Wichitas, and a little farther north, the Pawnees, also probably the Kansas Indians. But these were permanent settlements, but they were mostly mud, what we refer to as earth lodges, that were used during the wintertime by these semi-sedentary, semi-nomadic buffalo hunters in Kansas. So anyway, that map indicates the location where Coronado was going north and probably came back. We're pretty sure that he crossed through the Oklahoma Panhandle. Well, so what? But the point of this is that that expedition in 1541 was one that, and it was contemporaneous, of course, with the DeSoto expedition in the American South. But that area was one of the sort of the hinge points was around the Santa Fe area, the upper Rio Grande Valley. So Mexico is this, at least northern Mexico is a pretty difficult area. They're crossing through desert, but they're basically, the Spanish expeditions are following river valleys. And of course the Rio Grande is flowing basically north, even northeast, into New Mexico. So they were able to follow the upper Rio Grande Valley to this present day area where today we have the sort of heartland of the Hispano-Americans, or the Spanish Americans. So this is the area that is crossed through early on, and becomes actually viewed as an attractive area because this is, of course, where the Pueblos were located, sedentary American Indian populations, and they were farmers. And so the Spanish eventually figured this was, the sort of the best possible base for further northern, eastward, and western exploration from Mexico. Rather than just directly south, you're running into Sonora and pretty difficult terrain in northern Mexico. Northern Mexico would always be a frontier zone for the Spanish. All right, so let's go back to that previous slide. The Upper Rio Grande Valley is divided up into what Dr. Nostrand refers to as two different environments. There's sort of the upper river country, or Rio Arriba, and that is the area that has higher elevation. Because it has higher elevation, it has more precipitation coming from the westerlies. So it catches rainfall, and because it catches more precipitation over the year, it even has some timber resources. So it's better watered. It has timber available for construction, and it has a fairly mild climate during the summertime. It can get pretty cold in the wintertime, but it's nice and mild because it's higher elevation. The lower Rio Grande Valley, Rio Abajo, is the area that, of course, is lower, and because it's lower, it's drier, and its best asset is that it has a fairly long growing season. It gets pretty hot in the summer, but wintertime's not too bad, more like the Great Plains. So it's an area where the Spanish could grow things like cotton, that demanded longer growing seasons. So most of the settlement is up in the upper part of the Rio Grande Valley. So the lower part extends all the way down to about El Paso. Well, let's look at a little bit of the history of the Spanish in New Mexico. The first expedition was in 1598, and that's when Oñate arrived, and he recognized the possibilities in Rio Grande Valley with the Pueblos. It was not much of an effort to conquer the Pueblos. They were a pretty peaceful group, and of course, you remember the different land tenure systems of the Spanish at this time. The Spanish enacted the encomienda system, and so they basically divided the place up, and with the land went the labor, and the Pueblos were placed under the same sort of forced servitude as a lot of the native peoples did down in the Valley of Mexico much earlier in that same century. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church was part of this entrada, and the church established missions. I'll show you some pictures of the missions and some of the early surviving missions. They began to produce corn, beans, squash, wheat, is what the Spanish brought in. Of course, they were also able to produce wool, and northern New Mexico became a really significant sheep herding, wool producing area. Native peoples would incorporate wool and cotton textiles, and so the Pueblos were great weavers, and they produced textiles that were valuable and became important trade items. The encomienda system then allowed for some pretty severe exploitation of the Pueblos. In 1607, the initial encomendero, Oñate, was, he was viewed to be acting unethically, and so he was pulled back. The Pueblos eventually didn't stand for the encomienda system, and in 1610, after about nearly a century of the encomienda system, the Pueblos revolted. So before that, the the center of the urban center of Spanish New Mexico is Santa Fe, and it was founded in 1610. So, 1598, first entrada, 1610, actually some settlement. But you got to remember, this is on the far northern periphery of the Spanish viceroyalty of New Spain, and it's really frontier for the Spanish. Santa Fe was subservient to, of course, Mexico City, which was the capital of the viceroyalty, and of course the center of everything in Latin America at this time for the Spanish. But the Roman Catholic Church sent missionaries north, and they were fairly successful with the Pueblos. Lots of converts to Christianity early on. Again, incorporating a lot of the Pueblo culture that was not directly contradictory to the church's liturgy, beliefs and ceremonials. So a lot of times the Pueblo, the Native American ceremonies, or at least the cultural icons and that sort of thing, were wrapped up into the northern New Mexico church. But in 1680, the Pueblos organized enough to revolt against the Spaniards, and the Spanish suffered a major loss around Santa Fe. They removed quickly to El Paso, down to the south, and then, of course, Spain sent reinforcements over the years, and another entrada or reconquest was staged in the 1690s under Diego de Vargas. Vargas, I should say it correctly. And at that time, by that time, the laws of the Indies, had a recipe for conquest, and they established a presidio, and that then allowed the sort of marginalization of the Pueblos, and the Spanish began to grant land to agricultural settlers in New Mexico. So it was during the 18th century, the early 18th century, when Spanish colonists, and I'm saying Spanish, these are often second sons of the criollos, the Spanish colonists in New Spain, and they would come up and receive land grants, and you see the beginning of a village colonization effort. So this was actually really interesting because you have sort of a transfer of Spanish types of agriculture and Spanish farming and farm villages even into northern New Mexico, and those survive to this day to some extent. They've been under a lot of economic pressure over the last few decades, but the Spanish village type farm communities are what Dr. Nostrand has actually focused on in his research. So the Pueblos are somewhat allowed to go about their business after a while, but the other Plains Indians also have some input in terms of cultural impact toward the Spanish in New Mexico. Well, at this time, I've got some slides of some of the missions that are surviving. The Zuni mission at Zuni Pueblo. These again are from the Historic American Building Survey from the Depression era. So these are not new photos, but they document the old look. So you'll see some of this stuff in the work in the readings by John Cross on New Mexico, some of the iconic looking stuff. Here's the Pueblo, Acoma Pueblo in 1936. And these were indigenous settlements, kind of like apartment buildings with entry usually from the roof, and so you have ladders and such going up to the upper parts of this. This is, of course, in a really arid environment, semi-arid, arid, and these pueblos were built up high on the mesas. You can see in the background the three mesas that make up the pueblos in this area. A brick or a bread oven is another common site, or at least a traditional folk architectural form within the Pueblo areas. You also see the Pueblo, the original Pueblo building style with the logs that come through the sort of cantilevered through the roof and provide the basis for the roof and for the upper portions, the upper floors of the apartments, the dwellings. Some more shots of Acoma Pueblo in 1936. The ladders. An aerial view of Acoma Pueblo on top of the mesa. You see, this is kind of a formidable, well defendable location for the Pueblos. Another view of the mission at Acoma Pueblo. The mission kind of stands out as one of the larger, taller things there. So. All right, another area of the Spanish region is what we refer to as Pima land, or Pimaria Alta, the upper Pima country. And that's located in southern Arizona and northern Sonora. In southern Arizona, it's the area around the Gila River and south of there. And this was the area that the Jesuits were attracted to. Today is Arizona, of course. Like the Pueblos, eventually the Pimas revolted against the Jesuits and against the Spanish presence, and as in return, the Spanish established a presidio at Tucson in 1776, about the same time that things are being established in California, the 18th century, sort of middle part of the 18th century. Eventually, the Jesuits were recalled out of the Western Hemisphere, and the Franciscans replaced them. So Franciscan missions would be the norm throughout the rest of the time. Here's some photos from San Xavier del Bac at Tucson, and these are from the 30s also. Just go through these and you can have a look at them later. Some of these Habs hair. A lot of course, this is Spanish architecture, Spanish colonial architecture. That's the real deal. It's pretty amazing. And then here's a grotto, a sort of natural, sort of a cave that's been turned into a Catholic shrine near Tucson. And some more pictures of the mission and a chapel. All right, let's move on to Texas at this point. You can read about Pimaria Alta and New Mexico in Dr. Nostrand's text. I'm going to expand on some stuff on Texas that really you don't have much of. In Texas, like in Florida, you had geopolitics at play. And what I mean by that is the Spanish were interested in being there because their competitors were there. And in this case, the French were beginning to move up the Mississippi River, or they were actually coming down the Mississippi River from farther north, from what we'll refer to as the Illinois country later when we get to France and the French in North America. But it was easy to go down the Mississippi and get out from the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, but the entrance to the Mississippi was very, very difficult. So the French actually colonized by going downriver and then establishing themselves on the distributaries of the Mississippi, places like Bayou Teche, Bayou Lafourche in South Louisiana. Of course, that's where the Cajuns would settle. French Creole, the Creole French from the Caribbean, of course, established themselves in New Orleans. But even before New Orleans, the French fur traders had made an outpost along the Red River at present-day area of Natchitoches, and that's spelled Natchioches. Spelled. It sounds, pronunciation is nothing like it's spelled. It's pronounced Natchitoches, and that was the fort that the Spanish established early on in Louisiana. In fact, that's the very first French outpost in Louisiana. New Orleans would be established until 1718. But the Spanish answered that challenge from the French only 2 years later in 1716. And their fort, which was located only 15 miles west of the fortification at Natchitoches, was referred to as Los Adayas. So there were two forts only 15 miles away. On the east, Natchitoches, representing the French, and on the west, Los Adayas, representing Spain. And Los Adayas then was referred to, or in geography, we refer to things like forward capitals. That's a capital that's placed up against another, a frontier. So Los Adayas is a good example of an early forward capital. It didn't last very long. It was only manned for about 17 years, 16 years. And it was recognized as a sort of the base of a northern province for New Spain, which they began calling Tejas. So Texas had its very first capital at a place called Los Adayas, which is located today only 15 miles away from the town of Natchitoches, Louisiana. So Texas's first capital as a province or territory of New Spain was actually in the present-day state of Louisiana. Sounds like kind of a trivial thing, but Texas would have many different capitals over the years. Spain really didn't send many people to Los Adayas because it was really in the boondocks, and the only access to Los Adayas was by the Red River, which was a tributary to the Mississippi River. So the Spanish really didn't have access to Los Adayas except by land. So later on, they established a more permanent presence at Nacogdoches, which of course is in the present day state of Texas. Nacogdoches would become a mission, a Catholic mission, and a fairly successful mission as far as Spanish colonization of East Texas goes. It's really about the only significant area of Spanish mission efforts in East Texas. Got somebody got a question here. I'm going to try to check that out. All right. Melissa's in. Okay, there we go. So Nacogdoches, 1716, same year as Los Adayas, but Nacogdoches would soon become peripheral to the rest of Texas when San Antonio was established. And so the capital of Texas went from Nacogdoches just for a couple of years to San Antonio. and San Antonio would become a far more successful settlement for Spain in North America. Not comparable in terms of the numbers of people as you find in New Mexico, but from a sort of an official standpoint, San Antonio would become an important center of command and control within Texas. There were other missions and presidios located near the coastal areas of Texas, Bahia in 1722 and Goliad in 1749. But these were not as significant as San Antonio, the mission at San Antonio. And of course, what do we call the mission at San Antonio today? Everybody's muted. The Alamo, right? That's our shorthand for it.
Sorry, I was late. Sorry, I was late.
Oh, no problem at all. And you're in Houston, aren't you, Melissa?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So anyway, there are other, we've talked about missions and presidios and civil communities. Laredo was actually established as a civil community in 1755, pretty late, during the time of California settlement. But but Texas would be focused, or at least most of the activity in Spanish Texas would be focused around San Antonio. And San Antonio wasn't real successful at first, but in the 1730s, around 1731 is when you get sort of a revival of colonization in San Antonio. So it became eventually a civil community after the initial mission and presidio complex was built. And the most important infusion of expertise, farming expertise and capital came with the arrival of several families of Canary Islanders. We've talked a little bit about the Canary Islanders, or Canary Islands. Do you recall anything about the Canary Islands in this class up to this point? Maybe you haven't. I think it was maybe the very first one or two lectures talking about the Spanish as they were expanding out from the old world to the new world. The Canary Islands were colonized by the Spanish very, very early on. There, in fact, there were some indigenous peoples on the Canary Islands that basically got wiped out. The Spanish established sugar production on the Canary Islands, and so this was a very old sort of colonial Spanish presence of plantation owners. And the Canary Islanders arrived into San Antonio and sort of rewrote the rules, and became, got San Antonio to be, the area around San Antonio become somewhat successful agriculturally. Now, San Antonio is one of many settlements that were located along the Balcones Escarpment, which is the edge of the Edwards Plateau, which is a big limestone plateau that has fantastic water resources. So you're probably familiar with the canals in San Antonio, and the San Antonio River and the spring water that came out of the Edwards Plateau was sort of the basis of some of that good agricultural success that the Canary Islanders had. Now, by the 1730s, Los Adias was kind of it was squarely within Louisiana French territory, and so that was sort of given up. The mission at Nacogdoches, on the other hand, experienced pretty good establishment. But the piney woods of Texas was never much of an attraction to Spanish settlers the way the semi-arid parts of South Texas were. So the Spanish, the early Spanish colonists into South Texas, were they got agriculture going. They introduced ranching into South Texas, introduced cattle ranching, and by the late 1700s, they had a significant presence, and San Antonio was an important location up on the northern frontier of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Spain. By the time of the Mexican Revolution, by the time that Spain lost Texas to its to Mexico, to the independent state of Mexico, there were around 4,000 to 5,000 people living up in Spanish Texas, or Tejas. So these early Tejanos were able to to establish their own Spanish culture, similar to that of the Spanish in California. But anyway, I've got some slides here. You'll recognize some of these. Here's the Mission San Antonio de Valero at San Antonio, and that's of course what most people recognize as the Alamo. But the Alamo was not a presidio; it was a mission. So it was fortified with walls and had a large interior area where things could be there were plenty of food and that sort of thing could be contained. But this of course is today referred to as the shrine to Texas freedom, or Texas independence. And of course, what's the story with the Alamo? Can anybody help me out? Maybe somebody who's actually in Texas. What's the story of why is the Alamo so significant to Texas independence and Texas history, and maybe even American history? I'm putting you on the spot. Now, it's terrible that we only have a very small fraction of folks who are in the class actually show up, and then I pick on you by asking you questions, right? But that's just the way it works. So you don't have any pressure to answer here.
Okay. I do live in Texas, but I'm from Oklahoma, remember?
Okay, all right. But you didn't go to high school in Texas, did you?
Right. No, I didn't.
Oh, by the way, here, in honor of today's lecture. Okay.
I would guess. I don't remember, actually. I mean, I'm assuming it's just because it slowed down the process of
the people the folks who were defending the Alamo are considered patriots, right? Texas patriots. Because why? They knew they were doomed. One of the people who knew they were doomed was one of my heroes, a guy by the name of David Crockett. This is what he told constituents in Tennessee when he lost the election. He decided that he was going to move to Texas. So he did, and he died at the Alamo. Died defending the Alamo. Why didn't they give the Alamo up? Why didn't these how many, 100 and some individuals, why didn't they just surrender to General Antonio de Santa Anna? The reason was because, and this is outside, okay, this is past 1800, I know, but this is in 1836, but the reason was because somebody said it earlier, it slowed down Santa Anna's army. It bided time for other forces in Texas near Houston to organize an army that could then defend Texas against Santa Anna, who actually was the president of Mexico at the time. So So they gave their lives in order to allow another couple of battles to be won, and therefore the war to be won. So, but they knew that they were doomed, and they held it anyway. So that, to me, that's one of those things I'm intrigued and by Texas history enormously. But anyway, so this is some more pictures of the Alamo, and more. This is the chapel of the Presidio at Goliad that was established in 1749 by the Spanish, and then more of a Pueblo-and looking place in Presidio County, Texas, Fort Leaton. All right, now California. Got a little time left here. So in California, the Spanish weren't the first folks to arrive, really, or at least they weren't the last. The Spanish were, they were. It's strange to me that the Spanish were so slow to get to California, because after all, Spain and California have the same sort of climate. It's warm and sunny in the summertime, and not cold, just mild but rainy in the wintertime. And it's an area that's covered by oaks and grasslands and some mountains. But this was not an unfamiliar sort of climate to the Spaniards. But yet they really failed to colonize it very early. You can see that I have a list of the major presidios and civil communities within California here. They basically went up the coast. 1769, you have the Presidio of San Diego, the Presidio of Monterey in 1770, which became the provincial capital of Spanish California. The Presidio of San Francisco in 1776. Probably some of you even visited that. That's a big tourist attraction. And the Presidio of Santa Barbara, 1782. So those are the presidios that would then serve the missions, and there are a lot more missions, nearly 24 missions around California. And a lot of those missions then were they were locations associated with California native people. So American Indian groups in California sort of attracted the Spanish missions, and so a lot of the, if you look at the, by the way, there are more American Indian people with American Indian citizenship in the United States in California than any other state. Oklahoma's second, but California has the largest American Indian population. That includes a lot of people who are not California Indians, but a lot of the California tribes are referred to as mission Indians because of these early California missions. And a lot of those missions, of course, all the missions required, wine for the sacrament of communion in the church. And so they had a good reason to establish viticulture, the production of wine. And so the Spanish, of course, got the California wine industry going early on. So they were producing wine. There was one part of North America where you could definitely produce wine. There were also some civil communities, San Jose up in Northern California, or in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and in Southern California, and Santa Cruz back up north. And so these were agriculturally oriented communities. Los Angeles wouldn't amount to much of anything until later on in the later 1800s, really, when after the gold rush, way after San Francisco and the Bay Area started growing through immigration, Los Angeles would come along mainly as an area that was connected by railroad to the Middle West. So, but that's a story for a different course. So we have Spain in in California, but I wanted to mention that one of the reasons why the Spanish went up the coast was because at the same time there were Anglo-Americans and the British were involved in colonizing what we call today the Pacific Northwest, the place that's burning right now, Oregon and Washington. It was referred to as the Oregon country. But even in Northern California had been the most southerly extent of Russian colonization. We don't think of the Russians colonizing North America very much, but actually the Russians had already colonized Alaska, and they had towns and had established communities, mostly coastal communities within Alaska, especially southern and southeastern Alaska, and they were working their way down the Pacific coast during the 1800s. They even established the farthest point that the Russians had a permanent settlement was a place called Fort Ross, probably originally called Fort Roos, but on the maps it says Fort Ross, Fort Roos, which was located, I believe it's Sonoma County up north of San Francisco today, either Napa or Sonoma County in the wine country. But they established posts along, the Russians established posts along the North American Pacific coast because of the fur trade. They were involved in the fur trade. And in particular, they were after one species. Anybody want to guess what species that was? What animal attracted the Russians to California? That sounds like a quiz question. The Russians were after a fur-bearing water mammal. You want to guess? If you've ever visited Pacific Northwest, and especially if you've visited Alaska, you will have seen sea otters. Sea otters, they're really big fur-bearing animals, bigger than beavers, but they have some of the most prized fur in the world. And the Russians, of course, were great fur trappers and had expanded all across Russia and Siberia, trapping and collecting furs. And so they followed the sea otter down the coast of North America. And anyway, so that's we say Alta California as opposed to Baja California. So it's the area along the northern, for at least the Spanish, the far north of the Pacific coast. Now, I've mentioned the Indian population already, somewhat, but the Indian population in California were rather small groups. They were brought into the Roman Catholic faith at these missions. They also were engaged in, the Spanish made them agricultural laborers to produce things like wheat. The Spanish were growing, initially the Spanish grew those crops that they were familiar with in Spain. And so citrus, oranges, olives, I've already mentioned vineyards. They also raised a lot of sheep and cattle. So by the time the Americans started arriving into California in right around 1850, 1851, after the gold rush was starting, the Californio population, the Spanish descendants of these families that had settled in mostly these civil communities around Los Angeles and in the Central Valley of California. They weren't very many in number, but many of them were ranch owners. And so they owned these big spreads, these big ranchos. And what happened to them in the 1850s, again, is a story for another class, but they largely lost their land without much compensation at all. So I'll show you some slides here. This is, look at the landscape here. This is around San Diego. This is the mission at San Diego. And of course, if you've ever been to San Diego, you probably want to go back to San Diego. It's one of the most wonderful climates to human beings there is, I think. But it is it's a landscape of rolling hills and succulent natural vegetation, grasses, oak trees, and mild climates. Getting close to the time here. So this is the mission at San Diego. This is probably the most famous one, San Luis Rey in San Diego County, and some vineyards in the background. All right, let's finish up then. There, we'll talk about the Anglos arriving in later at New Mexico, and it's probably a good enough time to cut it off. So anything you all would like to discuss, or any other questions about any of this? All right, well then I'll go ahead and dismiss, and y'all have a great rest of your Monday. I'll see you hopefully back tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right, have a nice day.